Well, good morning. Good morning, everybody. I am looking out at this wonderful crowd this morning, seeing some new faces, which that always makes me happy, and some wonderful faces that I've seen for many years. So that makes me happy too.
Oh,
Humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Humanists strive to lead meaningful and ethical lives. We use reason and empathy to guide our decisions and actions. We live meaningful lives because we honor the fact that this is the only life of which we are certain. As humanists, we affirm the dignity and worth of all people. We do this not only to acknowledge all that humans have accomplished in the arts and science and humanities, but also simply for the possibility for peace and well being when people interact with respect for one another. Our birthday girl and president is our reader this morning. Thanks, Anne, for doing this.
not a problem.
Mhm.
Last week I did something a little funny. This week's not so funny.
Yeah.
I wanted to give you Trump's executive orders week one, and it's a lot. Federal workforce. Freeze federal hiring except for members of the military or positions related to immigration enforcement, national security, or public safety. Restore a category of federal workers known as Section F, which would lack the same protections enjoyed by career civil servants. Halt new federal rules from going into effect before Trump administration appointees can review them. Review the investigative actions of the Biden administration to correct past misconduct by the federal government related to the weaponization of law enforcement and the weaponization of the intelligence community. Grant top security clearances to White House staff without going through traditional vetting procedures. Yay. And remote work policies and order federal workers back to the office full time. Immigration and borders. Bar asylum for people newly arriving at the southern border. Move to end birthright citizenship, which is guaranteed by the 14th Amendment for the children of undocumented immigrants. Suspend the refugee admissions program until such time as the further entry into the United States of refugees aligns with the interests of the United States. A number of people were getting onto the planes and said, sorry, you can't get on, for waiting 7-8 years. Declare migrant crossings along the U.S.-Mexico border to be a national emergency, allowing Mr. Trump to unilaterally unlock federal funds for border wall construction without approval from Congress. Resume a policy requiring people seeking asylum to wait in Mexico while an immigration judge considers their cases. We don't have any immigration judges to do it. So, gender and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Terminate DEI programs across the federal government. Recognize two sexes, male and female. Remove protections for transgender people in federal prisons. Tariffs and trade. Order the government to assess the feasibility of creating an external revenue service to collect tariffs and duties. Energy and environment. Withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement, the pact among almost all nations to fight climate change. Declare a national emergency, energy emergency, a first in U.S. history, which would unlock new powers to suspend certain environmental rules or expedite permitting of certain mining projects. Attempt to reverse Mr. Biden's ban on offshore drilling for 625 million acres across federal waters. Begin the repeal of Biden-era-led regulations on tailpipe pollution from cars and light trucks, which have encouraged automakers to manufacture more electric vehicles. Roll back energy efficient regulations for dishwashers, shower heads, Trump and shower heads, and gas stoves. Open the Alaska wilderness to more gas and oil drilling. Yay. Restart reviews of new export terminals for liquefied natural gas, something the Biden administration had paused. Halt the leasing of federal waters for offshore wind farms. Eliminate environmental justice programs across the government, which are aimed at protecting poor communities from excess pollution. Review all federal regulations that impose an undue burden on the development or use of a variety of energy sources, particularly coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear power, hydropower, and biofuels. Other. Withdraw from the World Health Organization. He did that. We are going to rename Mount Denali and the Gulf of Mexico. So I think it's the Gulf of America now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure all the maps are going to, all the map makers are just in seventh heaven. Ensure that states carrying out the death penalty have a sufficient supply of lethal injection drugs. Goody. Fly the American flag at half staff on Monday and on future inaugural days. That was because of President Carter's demise. Implement the Department of Government Efficiency, the Elon Musk-led cost-cutting initiative. Yay. Revoke security clearances for 51 signers of a letter suggesting that the contents of Hunter Biden's laptop could be Russian disinformation. That was his final one. So those are just week one of Trump's executive orders.
I've been working real hard just not to pay attention. And thank you, Ann, for bringing that to our attention. It's something we need to remember. Thank you. The Humanists of Greater Portland is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. And the American Humanist Association has developed a list of 10 commitments, which are a gentle guide that recognizes behaviors that follow humanist principles. Our topic today, Religion and Science, incorporates the humanist commitments of critical thinking and humility. I'd like to now introduce today's speaker. You all know him, most of you know him very well. Laurent Beauregard was born the same year that Cheerios were invented. That's 1941. And he was raised as a Roman Catholic. He earned a Master's of Science at the University of New Hampshire in physics. And he went on to earn a PhD from Indiana University in the history and philosophy of science, including physics. He has taught at UCLA and Reed College. Laurent is a longstanding HGP member and is a pivotal part of the HGP website committee, which we all deeply appreciate. And he's worked for decades on that website, Laurent. Thank you so much. And now, would you please come on in and tell us about science and religion?
Okay, this morning, we're going to be talking about science and religion. And some of the things that we're going to be covering are things that we're all aware of. But I hope that there'll be at least one or two surprises that come up as we go into this subject. So the first thing that I want to point out is shown in this slide here. These are the differences that I see between science and religion, and they're all on very different levels. The first thing I want to point out is that science is relatively new. Science began with the pre-Socratics around 600 BC, whereas religion is as old as the dawn of mankind. I mean, it goes back, what, 200,000 years. There's a difference, 200,000 years old versus only as old as 600 BC. The next major difference between science and religion is epistemic and knowledge. Those two things mean the same thing. And for my purpose, cultural and values are the same. So there's a distinction between science and religion. Religion has to do with culture and values. Science does not. Basically, the nature of science has to do with knowledge and looking for facts in the world. The one that impresses me the most as a difference between science and religion is the distinction between cause and purpose. In science, you look for causes of things, whereas my slide has disappeared. It doesn't matter. I don't need to use it any. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I'm pushing the wrong buttons all the time. So cause versus purpose is going to turn out to be very, very important. What science is all about is finding the causes of things and not purposes. In religion, it's full of purpose and it's full of intention. And then finally, no big surprise, science is all about the natural, whereas religion is about the supernatural. Like 2 weeks ago, we had a presentation on the evolution of religion, and the presenter was talking about the role of natural selection in how religion evolved over the centuries. Looking at the history of religion that way seems reasonable, at least to me, but it's not the way I look at the history of science. I mean, it's not like there was anything remotely resembling natural selection itself that brought science about. When you look at the history of science, you're looking at the history of ideas. And in fact, speaking of natural selection, that itself is a scientific theory. So I'm going to go back to the pre-Socratics. I was just mentioning that science began around 600 BC. And I want to mention a few of the pre-Socratics because they are an excellent lead-in to a very, very important thinker that I'll be talking about, and that's Aristotle. So pre-Socratics, the first one was Thales, flourished around 600 BC. And Thales had the view that everything was made of water. Water was the basic fundamental element of everything. After Thales, you had Anaximander. Anaximander went one step up in terms of abstraction. For him, the basic thing of the universe was what he called the indefinite or the boundless. The next one, Anaximenes, and this is all like 600, 500 BC, Anaximenes had air as being the fundamental element of all of nature. And after Anaximenes, we had Heraclitus, and Heraclitus was really, really big on change, pointing to fire as the most important thing. In fact, you may already know that it was Heraclitus who came up with the catchy little saying, you can't step into the same river twice. So we've got these pre-Socratics. We've got one who had water way up there, another, Anaximenes, he had air up there. And now we've got Heraclitus with fire up there. You see where we're going with this? We're headed toward Aristotle, who had a view that there were 4 elements. What were Aristotle's 4 elements? Earth, air, fire, and water. 4 things, Aristotle. Now, the thing that's interesting, if you want to make that distinction between purpose and cause, the pre-Socratics did not have any purpose involved in their theories about what the fundamental stuff of the universe was. But when Aristotle took over those 4 elements, he got purpose back in. And he did it in the following way. Aristotle had a view that each of the 4 elements had its natural place, the place where it yearns to go. No big surprise here. Where does earth want to go? Down. Where does fire want to go? Up. What are the other 2? Air and water? Well, they're in between. Each one has its natural place, according to Aristotle, and that kind of introduces the purpose, the teleological aspect back in. And Aristotle's whole science, as free from appealing to any of the Greek gods, I should have mentioned that what the pre-Socratics did was just completely abandon the Greek gods, not in terms of holding them in a cultural way, but in terms of using them to explain anything about what was going on. So, you know, the god of love, the god of war, sure, they're still hanging in there, but they're not explaining anything. They're just part of, you know, what's going on in the culture. We're into Aristotle. He had 4 kinds of cause. Material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and final cause. efficient cause and final cause are the two that we're concerned with. Efficient cause is just what we all call cause. Final cause, that's just a fancy way to say purpose. Final cause for Aristotle was purpose. Just to fill this in, although we're not going to use any of it, material cause had to do with what things are made up of, and formal cause had to do with what goes on in mathematics. You do proofs, you're doing formalism. The next ancient Greek that I want to allude to, oh, by the way, Aristotle was somewhere around 200 BC. Now we jump ahead to 100 AD with Ptolemy, Ptolemy of Alexandria. And this is going to be very, very important in terms of the history of religion. Of course, what Ptolemy was putting out was the view that the earth was at the center of the universe. Hey, why not? This is our home. Why can't we be the central focus of it all, cosmically speaking? Well, that was Ptolemy's view, and that was readily taken over by Christianity, that earth was at the center of the universe. Well, all of those stories from the Bible, it's kind of like in the background, you know. And in a way, it's a view that the universe is fundamentally really all about us, which kind of goes against our feeling for what science is all about. Because what science is all about is, as I mentioned, just leaving out purpose entirely. So we have two things going on here: purpose in religion, purpose and earth centrality. St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, they're 800 years apart, by the way. Augustine is really early, and Thomas Aquinas is somewhere around 1200. Both of them were really, really heavy on putting forth the idea that faith and reason go together. Faith is the way that you get supernatural facts and revelation, and reason is what you depend upon science to get. And neither of them can contradict one another. They're both complementary. That was the view of Augustine, and it was also the view of Thomas Aquinas. He wrote a massive work, by the way. Maybe you know its title is Summa Theologica, Thomas Aquinas. And that book is absolutely the cornerstone of Catholic teaching. As a matter of fact, it occurred to me just yesterday, but I've known this all my life, being raised as a Catholic myself, that Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica is a basic text that's used in seminaries that train young men to be priests. I mean, it's really major, and it's still with us, and it's regarded as very important in Catholic circles. So what's the bottom line on all this so far, this history that I'm giving you? It's that there was no real conflict between science and religion. There was not seen to be any real conflict between science and religion. One thing that had a lot to do with that is that the science was basically wrong. So, you know, things were hunky-dory with respect to science and religion until, you guessed it, the scientific revolution. So now we're going to talk about scientific revolution. That means Galileo. No. It really all started with Copernicus. Remember, we were talking about Earth centrality. Well, Copernicus comes along and says that no, the Earth is not at the center of the universe. It's the sun. The sun is at the center, and the Earth is just one planet among others that are in orbit around the sun. You know, that sounds like almost common sense to us these days, but back then, that was a very radical idea. And the way it ended up, this is part of the story I'll be telling with Galileo and the Inquisition. It did end up shaking up the church, but guess what? At first, the church didn't have any problem with Copernicus and his idea that the sun was at the center, because they thought that, at least at the time, we're talking like 1543. This is when Copernicus's book was published. By the way, it's the same year that Copernicus died, 1543. They thought, well, you know, I mean, the creator did what he did in his infinite wisdom. And it's the way Copernicus said it was, then no problem, at least at first. Well, then Galileo comes along and insists the date here would be something like 1616, where Galileo is making a big deal out of Copernicus's theory. And the church starts to see that this goes against Earth centrality all of a sudden. And they told Galileo, stop, don't believe that and don't teach it. So Galileo did stop for a while. He bided his time, 1616. And by the time 1630 came along, Galileo decided to write one of his major works. It was the Dialogue on Two Chief World Systems. This is a very, very interesting book that Galileo wrote. It's a dialogue. It involves three characters, Segredo, Salviati, and Simplicio. I'll tell you more about Simplicio in a moment. Galileo had his tongue in cheek. He had these three characters debating the pros and cons of the view of Copernicus. And each character had his own, like Salviati was a Copernican, Segredo was a neutral on the subject, and Simplicio had the view that the Earth was at the center. And the way Galileo constructed his dialogue among these three characters was he put, well, I need to say this first of all. Galileo had had private conversations with the Pope years before about this whole thing, and that was okay at the time. But what Galileo did with the tongue in cheek is he put the views of the Pope in the mouth of Simplicio. Simplicio was regarded as a simple-minded character and functioned that way within the dialogue. And so there's an expression, what does it take to piss off the Pope? You've got it. This did not make the Pope very happy. And it was just about that time in the late 1620s that Galileo was hauled before the Inquisition and made to account for his misbehavior. By the way, the Inquisition was kind of a nasty, I mean, if you were a heretic, you were subject to be tortured for your heresy. So even though Galileo was a very famous person, he was shown the instruments of torture during the Inquisition. And so Galileo wasn't really keen on that happening to him. So Galileo recanted. Galileo actually recanted. And so on his way out, he is said to have muttered, "And yet it moves," under his breath. How did Galileo end up? He was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. So that is the story of Galileo. Oh, by the way, I should say that just by cosmic coincidence, Newton was born in the same year that Galileo died, and that year was 1642. So we're smack dab in the middle of the 17th century. And when I talk about the scientific revolution, even though I say it started with Copernicus in 1543, all the action was happening in the 17th century. And so what you end up with, going on to Newton, is Newton, well, you know the story. When he was a kid, he sat under the apple tree. The apple goes down. Newton says, "Hey, whatever makes the apple go down," it's the way his theory of gravitation was said to have originated, probably an apocryphal story. But anyway, what I really want to get to is Newton's great work, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, Principia Mathematica, philosophical principles of natural philosophy. Oh, by the way, the term natural philosophy, sometimes it was abbreviated as just philosophy. So when people at that time talked about philosophy, they were really talking about science. Philosophy and science were, names for the same thing, and sometimes just natural philosophy. So he wrote this work, and it was a pretty remarkable work. What Newton did was he took the discoveries of Galileo and the discoveries of a man by the name of Kepler. Now, Galileo, we're talking about mainly about the physics, is terrestrial physics, although Galileo was an astronomer who was one of the first to use a telescope to see what was going on up there. In fact, it was the use of it when he used this telescope, he discovered that Jupiter had 4 moons going around it, that Venus had phases, stuff like that. That's what made him put forth Copernicanism to begin with. But getting back to the role of Newton here, Galileo's physics was put together with Kepler's 3 laws of planetary motion. That came before Newton. Now, what were those 3 laws? I should mention, they were each of them mathematically formulated. The first law says that planets go around in an ellipse, not a circle, in an ellipse with the sun at one focus of the ellipse. It's the first law, Kepler. Second law of Kepler is that each planet, as it goes around, sweeps out equal areas in equal times. Well, that's something. Who would have known? Kepler knew. Kepler's third law is, oh, this is so obvious. The squares of the periods are proportional to the cubes of the radii. And that applies to each planet. So that was Kepler's third law. So we had 3 mathematical laws of Kepler that Newton was able to incorporate is the wrong word. Newton came up with his own system. The 3 laws of motion, the law of inertia, the F equals ma, the second law, and the law that action equals reaction. Those were Newton's 3 laws. And of course, the law of universal gravitation. He put those together into his major work and was able to actually deduce from that each of Kepler's laws and some of Galileo's discoveries in terrestrial physics. So that was a major unification. That's one of the things that's always interested me in the history of science, is every once in a while, there's a major unification that takes place. I think once, 3 or 4 years ago, I talked about that in connection with what Einstein did with electrodynamics and ordinary mechanics. He unified the two in his theory of relativity. This is a really impressive thing that happens in the history of physics. Now I go on to Laplace, Pierre-Simon de Laplace, major mathematician, physicist. And there's a really interesting story that has to do with the relationship between science and religion that relates to Laplace. Laplace had written a major work. It was called Mécanique Céleste, Celestial Mechanics. And it was major. It was in 5 volumes, and it put together everything that was known, all of the stuff from Newton and anything that came up after. And it was all there systematically put forth in the Mécanique Céleste. And we're talking about Laplace. He's French. Guess who was in charge of the French government at the time? Someone by the name of Napoleon. And I think some of you have heard this story. It's really a nice story. Laplace was called to Napoleon and to officially present his work. And he did that. And then Napoleon is supposed to have said to Laplace, "You have written this major work about the system of the universe, and not once have you made any mention of its creator." And so Laplace responded to Napoleon, "Sire, I have no need of that hypothesis." Does science need religion? You didn't think so, and we don't think so either. Science does not need religion. A nice little story there. I guess what I've said so far does raise questions. I want to leave plenty of time for any comments and questions that you might want to raise. There are a couple of more things I want to cover, though. You remember Stephen Jay Gould? You remember something called NOMA, N-O-M-A, non-overlapping magisteria. Yeah, that's what it is, non-overlapping magisteria. Oh, science, that's one magisterium. Religion, there's another. They don't overlap. And Stephen Jay Gould made a big point of that. That was around 1990, something like that, yeah. So that's worth mentioning. And now here's something that occurs to me that may not have occurred to you. One of my favorite philosophers, he died recently, his name is Daniel Dennett. He wrote a book called Breaking the Spell. And in chapter 8 of Breaking the Spell, he talks about religion, about people who are said to be believers, who profess religion, but don't necessarily believe in the individual dogmas. And I think we all know people like that. Why would they profess religion? Oh, it's a cultural thing. They want to get along with their neighbors, whatever, but they don't really literally believe in those things. So they profess religion. I think there's a difference between science and religion right there. You don't get people who profess science and don't really buy it, but you do in religion. Oh my goodness. I have some wonderful poetry to read to you that relate to our subject matter, and I don't know why I didn't insert them in. Question, was Newton religious? Any guesses? You think he was an atheist? Yes, Newton was religious. In fact, Newton wrote this about his work. When I composed my treatise, I had an eye upon such principles as might work with considering men for the belief of a deity, and nothing can rejoice me more than to find it useful for that purpose. Okay, fine. That's what he thought. However, remember that Laplace-Napoleon thing. I mean, there's nowhere in the mathematical principles of natural philosophy where there's any reference to God, needless to say. Here's another quote. There's a nice little couplet by the poet Alexander Pope. I love this one. Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. I was mentioning that the scientific revolution, or maybe I didn't say enough about this part of it, meant the deterioration of the Aristotelian worldview, of a purposeful view. And so I have a quote from John Donne. John Donne had written a very, very long poem called Anatomy of the World. And it's not really about the world, it's about all kinds of social stuff, but he comes to a certain point, and here's a passage that I think relates very, very much to what we're talking about this morning. So this is John Donne. And new philosophy calls all in doubt. Oh, philosophy, that means science. And new philosophy calls all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost, and the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. And freely men confess that this world's spent, when in the planets and the firmament, they seek so many new, they seek that this is crumbled out again to his atomies. 'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone, all just supply and all relation. Scientific revolution comes forth, and if you're really, really steeped in the philosophy of Aristotle, you see that it's all in pieces and all coherence is gone. Got to give you some Shakespeare. I looked this up on ChatGPT to see whether, I should say, John Donne and the lifetime of John Donne and the lifetime of Galileo are just about the same. They're contemporaneous. Shakespeare, not quite, but significant overlap. John Donne was aware of the work of Galileo, although he hadn't read Galileo, but stuff gets around. And Donne was knowing about the new science and the new philosophy. Shakespeare, not so much. And so I had this quote from Troilus and Cressida, which suggested to me that Shakespeare was on top of it, but actually this is about something else. But it's just too good not to read. The heavens themselves, the planets and this center, observe degree, priority, and place. In sister, course, proportion, season, form, office, and custom in all line of order. But when the planets in evil mixture to disorder wander, what plagues, what portents, what mutiny, what raging of the sea, shaking of the earth, commotion in the winds, frights, changes, horrors, divert and crack, rend and deracinate the unity and married calm of states quite from their fixture. oh, when degree is shaked, the enterprise is sick. And it sounded to me like that might relate, to what we've been talking about. Actually, it doesn't. But I had to read it. There's a quote from Weinberg that I think relates to all of this. He says about science, he says, the more we get to know the more science tells us about nature, the more pointless our lives appear to be. Everything that physics has to say about the way the universe works has nothing to do with asking the question, who am I? Why am I here? What am I doing? And things like that. And so that's pretty much all I had to offer on this thing. And I think that it would be good just to open it up. Comments are welcome. It's not so much a Q&A as, I'm not an expert on this stuff. I just put it together in terms of what I already knew, mainly about science and something about religion. Isn't that nice? I went to ChatGPT and said, is this thing copyrighted? And they said, yes. So ChatGPT said to me, would you like me to come up with an image that's just like that, but isn't copyrighted? And I said, sure. And he came up with this.
Laurent, thank you so much. I learned so much. We're going to have a good discussion, I'm sure. Thank you. Okay. Well, Hank, Rob, you have a question, comment, and go ahead. Come on in, Hank, Rob.
Yes. My understanding is that when Galileo was proposing his scientific work, he went to the Pope, as you said, and talked to him about it. And the Pope said, go ahead, but don't publish anything until you have it exactly right. And when he published it, he fiddled with his mathematics because what he presented was refuted by tidal tables which didn't comport to the mathematics that he presented. Is any of that true in your understanding?
That sounds right. That sounds right. That's a matter of detail that that went over me when I was preparing this material, but that's very possibly right. And if so, it's ironic that the church is telling Galileo, hey, be a little more careful with your science.
Thank you, Hank. Okay. Jules, come on in. You usually get last so often that I thought I'll see your name up here. Come on in.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
Well, thank you again. I have a question. Where does the second law of thermodynamics fit into the scheme of comparing science and religion? Second law of thermodynamics, which says that everything is going to greater and greater disorganization. Does it have a place in that history of science that you so well presented to us?
Tell us what you understand the second law of thermodynamics to be.
It's a law that says all things are tending towards greater and greater disorganization.
Oh, yes. Okay. It's the law of entropy increase?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Right. Yes.
Okay. Didn't deal with that.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jules. That was a beautiful way you asked that question. I'm really, really impressed. Thanks, buddy. Okay, we've got some questions here at the Friendly House.
You mentioned the year 200, or the date number 200,000 for the number of years since religion arose. And Helen and I had a discussion about this very thing just this week. And I started trying to figure out, is this really, what's the evidence that we had religion 200,000 years ago? And, the evidence is really weak. It's stuff that's taken to be, there's some evidence of things that are taken to be religious, but which you can come up with other reasons for. Particularly, about the main one is burial, that the practice of burial started about 200,000 years ago, but that might be for sanitary reasons or something. I don't know. Do you have any good evidence that we had religion 200,000 years ago?
I suspect that it's nothing that we would call religions today. It would be more accurate probably to say that there were, superstitious beliefs. That's really plausible to say that that's been around since the dawn of mankind. To say that about religion isn't quite accurate because it depends on what you mean by religion.
Laurent, I think I might have an answer too, or a little bit more information I can share. The HGP is reading a book called Nexus for our book club. So this book Nexus was, and I don't know the author off the top of my head, but I've been reading a little bit about this in this book. And the idea that Homo sapiens had stories. And I think when you talk about religion, it's the idea of stories, be it the stories of the stars,
Yeah.
or the stories of the gods, or the stories of superstition, or if you do this, this will happen, that is not based in.
Oh, I forgot.
And the beauty of this for us as Homo sapiens is that we were able, once we shared the stories, so that if a small tribe of 60 people believed in the same stories as a tribe of 60 or 70 people down the road a bit or across the creek, shared the same stories, they became a unit. And prior to this, the units of chimpanzees they maybe 60, 70 chimpanzees, Homo erectus, 60 or 70 small groups of people. The Neanderthals, there's no indication that they could bring together more than 100 people as a tribe, but Homo sapiens were able through through story to bring together hundreds of thousands of people, even though we're not physically connected in any way through religion. It became from the story turned into religion. And if it was, it's this part's in the beginning. It's a really long book. I don't know if I'm going to finish it or not, but that first 2 chapters really made such an influence for me, that because of story, he gave examples of the Jewish faith, that through their story of hanging onto that story, they have the country of Israel today. I mean, even though they were banished from that country 2,000 years ago. So the idea of story, and I think the story is religion. It's the beginnings of religion started with the story.
Okay, I meant my question. Do you have any stories 200,000 years ago?
Oh, no, not that early. I have evidence that
No.
there were even stories, but the point that Helen is making can be reinforced simply by observing that what's the Old Testament but a collection of stories?
Just a comment about science. It didn't strike me as that until we started doing experiments to measure what was going on in the world that we really produced science as we know it. I mean, the scientific method requires that you verify what you've been doing. I guess I'm a little sensitive because I spent a lot of years doing verification. I've done the experimental side. So until Galileo had observations, he didn't have anything to prove it. The math didn't prove anything until you had the experimental data to go with it. So it seems that that's, to me, the beginning of science. They're not Aristotle.
When I said one of the reasons why religion and science got along so well for centuries was that the science was wrong. The science was wrong by the kind of characterization you just gave. It's very, very important about observation and experiment, and Galileo did do that. But that older science, like, for example, when you put forth Aristotle's ideas about the things that I mentioned that Aristotle thought, yeah, Aristotle wasn't doing experiments. Oh, I take that back. I said I was only going to talk about physics. Aristotle actually did experiments in biology, but that's not part of what I was talking about. In physics, he did no experiments at all, and he was just coming up with these ideas about what made sense to him. In fact, Aristotle believed that heavier weights fall more quickly than lighter weights. Well, I mean, if anybody wants to put that to a test, it doesn't take fancy equipment to do that. So, you know, the belief that the heavier they are, the harder they fall had to go.
Yeah. Okay. Questioner number 3.
Yeah. I was curious if you've had, or I guess, do you have any sense of, or I think of the work of like David Sloan Wilson, the evolutionary biologist, about like looking at what can maybe science can't learn from religion about the functioning of the natural world, but does it have a lot to learn about like psychology and social organization? And I was curious if you've had any interaction with that.
I wouldn't be surprised if that were true, that religion can learn a lot about such sciences as psychology and sociology, the social sciences. But I haven't gone into any kind of a investigation about the influence of those, as it were, soft sciences interacting with religion. But the hard science, the physics, is what I'm familiar with. And that's what I was talking about really exclusively today.
Thank you. Okay, Anand, you're on Zoom. Could you please come in?
Sure, thank you very much. I'm thinking about Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he argues that science progresses through a series of paradigm shifts rather than linearly. I'm just curious if you see similarities between the resistance to scientific paradigms from within the scientific community and the pushback against science that came historically and continues to come from religion. Thank you.
Wow.
Wow.
That's a very interesting observation, because when certain paradigms are in place, as Kuhn wrote in his book that was just alluded to, this is the way research is done. It's done within the assumptions of the paradigm in question. And so, you know, I was talking a lot about scientific revolution. The one that I talked about was the first and the biggest, but then there were little mini scientific revolutions that happened after that. And those mini scientific revolutions after the first big one can be viewed in terms of, if maybe some of you have read this Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, this paradigm shift. And there was, like, for example, a paradigm shift when Einstein came along. You know that thing I made a big deal about, Newton's universal law of gravitation? The inverse square law. It's beautiful. It works. You can use it to calculate the orbits of planets and stuff. But it's wrong. I mean, Einstein told us that that's not what gravity is. Gravity is curved space-time. What on earth does that have to do with an inverse square law of attraction? Nothing.
Good questions. Let's see. Thank you, Anand. How about questioner 4?
So your question on time, 200,000 years, and your lovely comments on an important step in human social evolution involved the storytelling capacities. And I just want to throw out that the branch of anthropology, archaeology, has increasingly clarified that about 70,000 years ago, there was around the world a significant shift in the diversity of our tools. It became more complex. At the same time, there was a significant shift towards greater complexity in whatever little bits of art we find. So around 70,000 years ago, some stuff happened that allowed for greater complexity. I'm going to pass on the suggestion. It has not been proven of some anthropologists who say probably that same time increased our capacity for communication and for storytelling. And so to do with timing, I would just say Homo sapiens of, let's say, 150,000 years ago, didn't have everything going that we do. But some mutations that were clearly favored around 70,000 years ago made it such that, to the question of timing, okay, religion might not be 200,000 years ago, but I'd be willing to bet a substantial amount that it's over 60,000 years old. And so the comparison between 60,000 and 500 and some to the scientific revolution, 2000 and some to those early Greeks, is still a vast, vast difference. And there's some interesting stuff, and I wish I could be part of that book that you've got. Really, I've heard good things about it, and I just heard some more good things about it.
It's a hard read because it's big, but it's fascinating. I'm just really enjoying it, but I got to take it in little pieces. Let's see, we've got someone else on Zoom. How about Hank Robb?
So I don't know if you agree with him, but E.O. Wilson, in his book, The Social Conquest of Earth, argues for group selection as well as individual selection. And if he's right about that, couldn't the explosion of what we are calling science be seen as an instance of group selection?
There is one thing that does come to mind, and see if this resonates. In terms of natural selection, my understanding is that it's at least the way Richard Dawkins put forth, he alludes to genes and natural selection. Now, the concept of a meme is supposed to be analogous to the concept of a gene. And so when you talk about natural selection in this broader sense that's being alluded to here, it could be that the notion of a meme functions in the same way that the more biological, physical concept of gene does. Anyway, there's that analogy going on, and that might be relevant.
That the group is grabbing that thought as a.
So I was curious what makes sense in terms of defining the beginning of science. You know, if we're talking about the beginning of religion as telling stories, you know, why wouldn't the beginning of science be observation, experimentation, and telling stories that are true based on that? And if that's the case, you know, maybe they start at the same time, science and religion. Or do you not define science that way at all?
I think I have, if you would let me answer this, I would certainly appreciate it, because I have a strong feeling about this. Very strong. May I?
Please, yeah.
When people started to go into, for those of you that don't know, I worked many years at the Oregon Burn Center. So wound healing to me is a passion. And yesterday we were at Linfield teaching a course in wound healing. So I'm still involved in that. And as part of the program, we look at the early healers. The early healers use science, really observation and experimentation, to heal using lamb's wool, or lamb's ear, which is a plant as an absorbing dressing. Also using the yarrow and aloe, and all these plants could be used as a way to heal, promote healing. Now, they didn't know germ theory, they didn't know to wash their hands, but they figured things out, and they were the first evidence-based practice of how to heal a wound that was they could watch and do. They couldn't do anything about an appendix or something that was rupturing inside, but the skin was out there. So I think the science of nature was there long before 400 years ago. There's a lot of screw ups too. Galen, who treated the gladiators, invented stitches, which was a wonderful thing to do, bringing the skin together. He also invented putting cow dung on those stitches to promote pus that he had to have for healing, which was ridiculous. But he screwed up there. But he brought in some really good ways to heal these gladiators, including sewing them back together. And I thought that was pretty pretty fascinating. But they never codified it until it became books, and they began to publish. Everything was word of mouth. The story of healing. Around 1600, they started writing encyclopedias of how to heal wounds.
But I'm thinking even further back, maybe even prehistoric.
Yes.
What foods he had word of mouth,
Through science,
practice.
right.
Just
absolutely.
Showing people. So is that not science? If it's correct and if it's being passed on, if it's observation and experimentation,
right?
Is that science or not science? The way you're running.
I think that observation and experimentation apply to later science. The earliest science, the kind of science that started with the pre-Socratics, didn't have to do with that at all. It had to do with the worldview that got rid of the gods and looked at familiar materials as being, pick one, water, air, fire, as being what the universe was really all about. That's not based upon experimentation, and it's not right.
Could there be experimentation in prehistoric societies and they come to a correct conclusion? And is that a form of science, or is that an early evolution of science? You see what I mean? Because it doesn't all have to be just stories you make up and superstition. You're also going to land on the truth through experimentation. And I would argue that's human nature.
Oh, to experiment, yeah.
So
No, that probably happened, and you could look at it as the beginning of that part of science. Yeah.
There were at least a central reason why the scientific revolution was considered revolutionary.
Okay.
And if I can add a little bit, and by the way, I would agree that humans throughout time have haphazardly and accidentally hit on profoundly important observations and come occasionally to correct conclusions. But here's what's profoundly different. See what you think. At the time of the scientific revolution, what was really a central thing that was new was that it's okay to question. It's not only okay, it's positively good. Think about 1,000 years before, when there was still plenty of religion around. If you questioned the wrong question, you were at least a new branch on the tree of branching religion. You were a heretic and out, or as you gestured with your hand, that was the end of you. So questioning was not encouraged and not okay, and reaching new conclusions was dangerous. That's systematically, centrally different, because in science, when we got over that hump, it sure, experts in a field, if there's some new hotshot, they get pissed. They have egos. They don't like new questions, something that was temporarily established. But science has this wonderful track record of being self-correcting, because they're really committed to the idea that everything can be questioned and should be questioned. And when you have verified evidence that, last week's idea needs significant updating, they friggin' update it, and they don't behead people.
Right.
So there is profound, important difference. Again, ancient people, no doubt, haphazardly, but systematic science does it systematically, rigorously, with lots of built-in structure to say, get around to changing your mind. That's the precursor to asking questions is, am I willing? If I get evidence I don't even like, am I willing to change my mind? That's science. That's not religion.
That's right. Thank you. That's a really good point. But I feel strong too that we've bumped into ideas and found things, but the idea of you can change your mind is so important. We can change that feel free to change your mind is.
You grew up in the Roman Catholic Church. They're doing the same. So did I. They're doing the same ceremony that they did 2,000 years. I mean, 1,500 years ago. So it's theirs is, this is what we do, and this is how we practice, not changing. Thank you for sharing that point.
You put the rise of science from 400 or 500 years ago. There were two things that happened then that maybe you could comment on as to how important these things like this might be. But I think middle 1500s was the first time anybody ever calculated an average. And that would be like there was no such thing as an average until then. And around 1620, I think it was, Francis Bacon kind of got the English patent system going. So where, you could make money by patenting a steam engine. And then once you could make money by patenting a steam engine, you had a reason to build precise mechanical parts. So you had a reason to have precise measurements, which then that enabled science to really go crazy with measuring stuff and seeing what really happens. So those two things, for example, that are kind of more just kind of coincidental or something, could be something like a driving wheel to all this change.
Well, what you're bringing up is what kind of technology happens in the wake of scientific discoveries, and that's something that I've not looked at. It happens for sure, and if you're wondering if it's coincidental, I would say, well, probably not entirely coincidental.
We've got a question from Gretchen. Gretchen, come on in.
Okay, thank you. A couple of things. The more you guys talk, the more ideas come to mind. I mean, this idea of heresy, it wasn't just a problem back at the time of the Inquisitions. That in England, at the time of the American Revolution, heresy was a crime. And from what I understand from various sources, I can't quote at the moment, a lot of our founding fathers called themselves deists because they were able to avoid the heresy accusation, but at the same time they could scoot away from, a personal involvement with a personally concerned God. Anyway, the other thing to me, it makes total sense that human beings would develop a belief in the supernatural. If there's one thing we want to do, it's to make life easier and more comfortable and secure for ourselves. And inevitably, there are going to be floods and pestilences and stock die-offs and, attack from beasts, so forth. And there are things we really, really like that make us happy in the natural world. And this tendency that we have, and I'm sure it developed some point in the early days of our species, maybe part of it, was the tendency to attribute intention to things that happen because it's a thing that enables us to interact. Somebody doesn't have to tell me what they want. I can see from the fact they're headed toward the grocery store door with their sacks of groceries, they're going to go out. And my notion is if I want to help them, I can open the door. They don't have to say anything. And this idea that, there's a volcano up there that periodically erupts. Well, yeah, there's an intention. There must be something really powerful causing this very powerful negative event. And the idea that, well, if it were a human being, what would it like? Well, we'll give it some nice gifts. We'll give it some food. We'll sing it a song. We'll say nice things about it. And early days of religious belief, in my understanding, is animism. And that was a belief that essentially everything that is significant in the natural environment has a spirit. That rock that you trip over, should you give it a gift? Should you kick it? Should you, but everything should be treated as though it has its own intentionality.
Spoke 2 weeks ago, talked about that, that feeling of life in inanimate objects. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we're just about ready to stop. Lauren, is there any closing comments you'd like to make as we finish our program?
No, I don't think so.
Feeling good. You did a really good job. Thank you so much. And wonderful.